the virus, number one, and the reach of the virus across every continent and every country, regardless of the efforts that we all made around the world, teaches us a number of things. First is that we have to believe in science. We have the best scientists in the world telling us over and over again what we needed to do to prevent its spread. We have scientists in the climate world, in the biodiversity world, telling us that mixing human beings and animals and encroaching on territories was a very bad idea that would lead to pandemics of this sort. We've had scientists telling us what we need to do to stay safe during this crisis. And unfortunately, all of us, from our leaders to individuals, many of us anyway, have found it impossible to believe in the science, and therefore we act in our own self-interest. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons of this pandemic, is the need to believe and trust in scientists who are there to provide data and information, all of which is available for us to interpret and behave accordingly. I think the other great lesson of the pandemic is the need to be prepared. And whether you're talking about climate change, or you're talking about COVID-19, or you're talking about Ebola, all of these issues are in a way related to each other, and being prepared for them when we have the scientific data, when we have the information, we have the capacity, and we're ignoring it, is another great lesson of the pandemic. I think the third and final and most important element is the need to heed the consequences of behaviors, whether it's COVID-19 or the pandemic, that have long-term consequences. Most of us live for what's in front of us, for this day or this week, and planning for the future is something that human beings as a group are not terribly sophisticated at or preparing for when it comes to threats that aren't known at the time. And so we have to understand that, at least with climate change, at least with pandemics and other issues that will affect all of us, that the need to think about the future, to plan for the future when it's so difficult for us to do so, is probably the third and most important lesson of the virus. I think, as you've seen in this pandemic, leadership is probably the most important thing, although each of us individually had a responsibility to stay 6 feet apart or to take other precautions, all of which I understand. But I think for someone from the environmental community, while we are always promoting individual behavior and the importance of individual behavior, I think the single most important action that an individual can take is to understand the importance of and vote for leaders who care about long-term consequences and who are willing to prepare for the future. And I think in the case of this particular virus, you've seen countries where leadership was quite in evidence. Governments, NGOs, faith groups, everyone worked in unison and stepped up to the plate to make something uniform happen in their countries. And those countries were rewarded with low COVID deaths. They were rewarded with less of an economic strain. They were rewarded with more time in schools for their children and in planning for the future. And in other countries, many of which are obvious, the pandemic spread like wildfire for lots of reasons, the most important of which were the leaders failing to consider globalization as important, understanding that, like climate change or environmental issues, whether it's oceans or other issues, biodiversity loss, it has impacts way beyond your own borders. And so I hope that when we do take that individual action to prepare for future crises, that we not only prepare ourselves mentally for what can happen, but also that we elect leaders who will actually care about both short and long-term consequences. Because unless you care about both of those issues, you can't solve an issue like a pandemic that travels invisibly and without the slightest bit of concern for country borders. purpose of an environmental group or a planning group or a refugee group is to manage future risk. And we share that with corporations and governments. And so the most important thing, I think, in recognizing how we deal with global crises, climate change, water resources, oceans, COVID-19, economic downturn, is to view the world as a risky place and do your analysis, do your planning, create your programs, create your businesses, manage your governments in a way that minimizes risks, both for the economic system, for individuals, and certainly for the future of our planet. And I do think most people would agree, we're all in the same business. And once we recognize that, we can work together much more effectively to manage those risks, to plan for the future, and to prevent crises like these, climate change, COVID-19, discrimination, all the things we're facing now. We have to learn how to manage those risks and plan for them accordingly. As we all know, this has been not just devastating to us and from a mental health perspective and from the extraordinary deaths worldwide, but the global economic downturn will have long-term consequences for environmental protection. And so if we work together, if we manage those future risks, I think the next time this happens, if it ever does again, and certainly it is happening with climate change, that perhaps having that interest in and focus on risk will allow us to avoid these kinds of crises in the future.